Hey there, welcome to my new series where I'm going to be discussing all of the Magician's Nephew, one chapter at a time. I've been wanting to do a more detailed chapter by chapter discussion of some Narnia book for a while. And I thought to myself, well, it makes sense for me to start with The Magician's Nephew since, first off, it's my favorite of the books, and it happens to also be the first book in terms of the in-universe chronology, even though it was the last book to be written. I'd also argue that this book seems to me to be one of the highest quality books in the series in terms of artistic excellence and literary polish. I think there are two possible reasons for that. First, I think that you can actually see a steady increase in literary excellence as the series goes on, so that the last three books he wrote seem to me to have a much more of a polish and excellence about them than any of the ones prior to it. And then secondly, I think The Magician's Nephew has a more refined and concentrated form, probably because Lewis spent so long working on it. How I've heard it described is that he had a good deal of the story finished for a relatively long time compared to his other stories, but was just continually just not satisfied enough to have it published. So he just kept on revising it and changing it and improving it until he finally thought it was ready to be published, and he published it. And so that account helps me make sense of how I've always felt that it was one of the most well-written stories. And then particularly the older I get, the more I see such a dense and high quality intentionality in its content and structure. And all this makes so much sense if this is because it literally is a more refined project because he kept on improving it due to his love for Narnia and his desire that this final installment, this prequel installment for his passion project, had to be just right, had to be perfect. And in my opinion, the result is that, in fact, it is. It is just right. It is perfect. I don't think there's any drop you could change about The Magician's Nephew that could make it the slightest bit better. I think it's just absolutely perfect. I think it's the finely refined gold of a prequel starter for the Narnia saga. Thanks for your dedication, Jack. Your work, Mr. Lewis, gave me so much fun and enjoyment back when I was a little 8 to 12-year-old. This book is lodged into my memory and into my childhood experience, and it's absolutely brilliant. It's thrilling, it's beautiful, and it's so spiritually and psychologically and experientially profound. I can't help loving it, and I can't help being grateful to God and to you, Mr. Lewis. So thanks for being so discontent that you worked on this thing so passionately and tirelessly and then actually shared it with the world of children and the world of publishing 36 years before I was born. Your investment is still bringing in its fruit. So anyway, y'all. So my favorite Narnia books are in this order: The Magician's Nephew, The Silver Chair, The Horse and His Boy, and The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, in that order. And the first two in that list are a very close tie, Magician's Nephew and The Silver Chair. And the last two are also a close tie as well, The Horse and His Boy and The Dawn Treader. And then if I were to go back to when I was a little 10-year-old or so, however old I was, my favorites were The Last Battle, followed closely by The Magician's Nephew. It was a hard decision. It was hard to decide, but I pondered the question of which was my favorite Narnia book, and I finally made up my mind. And then at that point, next in the list would have been The Horse and His Boy. Not as close as the other two. The other two were like neck to neck. It was hard to choose. The Horse and His Boy wasn't as close as them, but it's still a story that I always had a special love for. Another reason I find it more appealing to start with The Magician's Nephew in a discussion series like this is because I think The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which is where I think a lot of people would probably start, I think that story has entered public awareness through film in ways that I think kind of overexpose and even disadvantage the book in certain ways. The 2005 Disney movie, in particular, has such a different style and emphasis from the book that I think a lot of fans of the movie are possibly likely to simply dislike the book. I haven't seen that movie since I was a teenager, but when I did see it then, I was so dissatisfied it made me upset and also made me appreciate the books more, just kind of by contrast. And from what I've heard other people say, it sounds like the second movie that came after it was even less representative of the source material than the first one was. But anyway, so it just seems like discussing a book that hasn't entered into modern popular culture through mass market driven Disney movies kind of makes it seem a little simpler to just be able to discuss it as an engaging and thought provoking classic from 1955 rather than having to get off in the weeds about questionable pop culture manifestations. Though I suppose discussing that book would probably get me more views off the bat for exactly the same reason. So there's that, I suppose. But anyway, I'm starting here anyway. So, so before we get started, Let me just kind of give you an idea of what my series of videos is going to be like. So I'm planning to do a video for each chapter for the most part. And if you want, you can go through each chapter yourself before watching my discussion videos. But I'm also planning to try to summarize each chapter as I go, so that won't be quite as necessary, particularly if you've read the book before at some point in the past, at least. And for myself, as I'm getting ready for each video, I'm using the Kindle ebook version, which has the original 1955 illustrations by Pauline Baynes. And then just to make it feel a little more engaging, I'm also going through the audiobook from Harper Audio, narrated by Kenneth Branagh through Audible. Over the last 10 years or so, I've really enjoyed going through those Harper Audio audiobooks a number of times, which has been my main way to get to return to Narnia as an adult, since I could listen in the midst of my busy life while doing other things. They're pretty good readings, and even though they don't do voices and stuff like the Jim Dale audiobooks for Harry Potter, but they're still very well read and engaging. And I particularly have some really wonderful memories of listening through The Silver Chair as a first return to Narnia during a particularly dry part of adult life, and just being blown away by how much better the story was than I had remembered, since my mind had changed as I grew in those years in between. And so I ended up seeing different things than I used to, and I was just really surprised and impressed by how much C.S. Lewis put into that book in terms of significance and meaning. And then around the same time, I remember thinking it was just so cool to be able to hear Patrick Stewart reading The Last Battle in that same Harper Audio series. Really an excellent reading, and it's just a lot of fun to hear a familiar voice, especially someone like Patrick Stewart, for an old Star Trek fan like me. So anyway, I'll be going through the audiobooks and the ebook, and that way I can take notes as I go through it, just like I do when I'm discussing a movie or a show. It's also going to be fun because since I've used the audiobooks for almost all of my adult returns to Narnia, this will be the first time I've seen the original illustrations since I was a kid. In some cases, probably the first time I've seen them ever, because particularly for the ones in this book, I don't think I've ever seen them before. And I wondered if the editions that I read as a kid just didn't have the illustrations or any illustrations at all. All right, so now that we got the preliminary stuff out of the way, let's start talking about The Magician's Nephew. And before we get into that first chapter, let's just say a couple things about the setting. So when you pick up an old-ish book like this one, you really got to do a little bit of time traveling. So for Narnia, we travel back to the early 1950s. And for this final book in the series, it's 1955 when it was published. And since the first story in the series, the wardrobe story, was released in 1950, and this is the last one, so this is the end of about a 5-year period of these things coming out. And like I said, this was the one that Lewis was working on and off for a good while before he finally released it because he felt it had to be just right. So, for our context, it might help to think of some other things you might remember from 1955. For me, what helps is thinking of 60s TV, and then you kind of turn back the clock 10 years from that. And then, of course, for this story, we're also going to have to keep in mind that the story itself is set quite a bit before the time it was written, because it's a prequel to the stories about the Pevensey children, such as the wardrobe story. The narrator kind of sets the context by telling us that this story takes place around the same time as Sherlock Holmes and the Bastables. Never heard of them before. So Google tells me that the time setting for Sherlock Holmes ranges from the late 1870s to 1914. And according to the Narnia wiki, the Bastables reference is referring to an 1899 novel. So I'm going to guess that Lewis is trying to take us to sometime around the turn of the century, give or take a couple of years. So a time that you might be familiar with if you've read classic fiction that's in the public domain, such as the Oz stories, which start in the year 1900, or such as Alice in Wonderland, 1865. Or you might think of a movie that's set around the same time, such as the 1985 Return to Oz movie, which is also set in 1900. So anything like that can kind of give you a visual to help you imagine what kind of world Lewis is trying to drop us into. And by the way, speaking of Oz, I have to say, though I've never heard anything that would connect Lewis with Oz in any way at all, and although clearly the flavor of Narnia is so much more classically influenced and more dignified in tone than what you get in the Oz stories, in terms of Narnia being shaped by ancient classics and mythology and things like that, rather than the more whimsical nature of the Oz stories. But it is interesting. I did notice recently that it's kind of interesting that the premise for The Marvelous Land of Oz, that's the second Oz book, does bear a striking resemblance to the premise for The Horse and His Boy. Doesn't mean there's a connection, but it would make sense to me if Lewis had at least come into contact with the Oz stories at some point, even though obviously his primary shaping influences would have been the more ancient classics and mythology and other things that he would have come into contact with as a lover of true classics and as a scholar in the field of literary studies. So, who knows? Anyway, so Chapter 1, The Wrong Door. And if you've read the chapter, you know that the chapter title is about the fatal wrong door that the children creak open from the attic crawl space, and out of which emerges the whole book. because of that one fatal releasing of the catch and creaking that door open. But before we get to that point, why don't we just go and start from the beginning? So the chapter starts with the narrator telling us that this story is set, quote, when your grandfather was a child, and then he ties the time period to Sherlock Holmes and the Bastables, like I said a minute ago. And I also just have to say, I just love the casual, almost oral storytelling style that Lewis uses throughout his Narnia books, using phrases like long ago when your grandfather was a child, or if I told you what these monsters really look like, your parents would never let you read my book, and things like that. I've always thought it was just so funny how he uses these kind of roundabout ways that kind of make it sound like he's telling a story to a group of kids, or maybe telling a bedtime story to somebody, but which also make it possible for him to explain really complicated things without using any big words because he's dipping into this down to earth kind of out loud chatting style. It's definitely a unique and memorable style, the way Lewis has the narrator talk throughout the Narnia books. And I think that uniqueness is one of the charming things that makes it so fun in the nostalgia kind of way, so fun to come back to the books as an adult. So anyway, so right away here at the beginning, we are introduced to Polly Plummer, as she has her first run-in with the little boy next door who's staying with Mr. and Mrs. Ketterley. I think this opening scene is just an absolutely beautiful little scene as these two really believable characters, these two kids, bump into each other and make friends with each other right away. There's also something very tragic and believable about the premise of Digory's emotional and psychological presentation. And this is the kind of thing that becomes so much more real when you're an adult. Because most kids, or at least I can only speak for myself, but most kids can't really relate with the intensity of Digory's experience. Some can. But just like all the Narnia portrayals of children and the various situations that they're thrust into, Lewis really describes a richly compelling picture of a kid going through a real set of experiences and having a very normal psychological fallout from those experiences. In this case, we get the feeling right from the get-go as he's exchanging pleasantries with the neighbor girl. We come to feel the intense and palpable loss, upset, discontent, loneliness, grief, and fear that are overwhelming Digory. He's in an unfamiliar, strange place, and his mom is dying. And so he is a cranky and poorly behaved and angry kid. And he's crying a lot. And boys at this age, I'm guessing he and Polly are probably somewhere around the age of 10, though I don't think the book says at any point. But boys at that kind of age don't want to be seen crying. And he almost immediately gives up and just admits the fact, almost suggesting that he's been caught crying so many times that his fight to save face has just disappeared. And so he just kind of gives up and admits it. Let me just read that section because I think it's so cool. All right, I have then, said Digory in a much louder voice, like a boy who was so miserable that he didn't care who knew he had been crying. And so would you, he went on, if you'd lived all your life in the country and had a pony and a river at the bottom of the garden, and then been brought to live in a beastly hole like this. London isn't a hole, said Polly indignantly, but the boy was too wound up to take any notice of her, and he went on. And if your father was away in India, and you had to come and live with an aunt and an uncle who's mad, who would like that? And if the reason was that they were looking after your mother, and if your mother was ill and was going to die? Then his face went the wrong sort of shape, as it does if you're trying to keep back your tears. This is the kind of scene and that kind of dialogue that just breaks your heart as an adult because this kid is so unmistakably and so clearly real. This is no made up kid. This kid is real, and no one should have to go through that. Well, anyway, so she changes the subject and asks about his aunt and uncle, and he uses the word mystery as he answers. Either the uncle is mad or there's some other mystery. And he tells her about all the strange things, and Polly finds it really interesting. But the reason I note that is because the theme of mystery is going to come up a number of times in this chapter and then also in the rest of the book. And I think we can say that mystery or the unknown, a kind of lack of knowledge that provokes curiosity and fascination. This mystery factor is something that Lewis inserts into the story to appeal to the children, particularly Digory, but Polly as well, and also to appeal to the reader. And the reason is because he knows that children, especially children who aren't surrounded by technology and the media-based entertainment we have today, children are fascinated by mystery. And the thrill of curiosity is one of the things that drives children and holds them captive with trance-like delight. Hence, the children, like myself as a little kid, kept on reading powerlessly. We couldn't help keeping on reading. And hence also the children, like Polly or Digory, keep on exploring. Well, anyway, so Digory and Polly become friends and start playing together. Before long, Polly shows him her smuggler's cave, as she calls it. This cozy little hideout she made on top of the rafters at the beginning of this long crawl space that comes off of her attic and just kind of extends throughout this whole long string of connected houses, stretching on seemingly infinitely off into the distance. And I think this scene here is one of the first depictions of this personality distinction between Diggory and Polly. While both of them are captivated by mystery and curiosity, Diggory, as a stereotypically masculine boy, has a stronger connection with that impulse and a stronger felt need to fill in those unexplored gaps of experiential knowledge. Whereas Diggory is compulsively driven by this curiosity or this need for experiential knowledge, Polly, we'll find out later, is more driven by things like beauty or the felt need to experience order and beauty and things that feel meaningful and things like that. So whereas Diggory's first impulse is this overwhelming urge to go and explore the crawl space, Polly actually never really thought of that until now. Her first thought of what should be done with this kind of crawl space was to give it a floor and make it into a haven full of all her treasures and declare it to be a smuggler's cave. Both Polly and Diggory both understand this crawl space to be this priceless and special thing that they discover. That's why Polly showed it to him, because it's so cool. They both see its value, but what they want to do with that special discovery is a little bit different. Not because they share completely different desires. She does value mystery and fascination and exploration as well. Not because they have completely different desires, but different levels of balances or ordering of the desires or proclivities exist within their personalities. And much of this does fit in a very classical, stereotypical way into the real life male female distinction that often is seen between boys and girls. Anyway, so Diggory suggests seeing if they can use the crawl space to get into the abandoned house down the road. He convinces her, and they try to do the math and count the number of rafters that it would take to get to that house. And then after they try to do the math on paper, they get separate answers that don't line up, and they finally keep doing it until they get answers that look right, and so they head off. But it's interesting, as they talk about the house, they use that same word again, mystery. This is the allure, both for Diggory and for the reader. Same word and same feel, both for odd Mr. Ketterley and for the abandoned house, which, interesting note, the reader never does end up seeing. So Lewis's emphasis here on the mystery of it all, it isn't to actually lead the reader toward uncovering that mystery, which never happens, and so it can't matter all that much. But instead, its role is so that the reader can eagerly follow Diggory in Diggory's search for something to thrill his imagination and hold his attention. Diggory has imagination, that's why he loves exploring. It drives him and characterizes his identity as a little boy. Unfortunately, in our modern media age, children tend to not have the same kind of imagination or thrill because they don't have to go searching for something to get the same kind of buzz that Diggory's looking for. And so normal life today becomes very boring. Anyway, so they finally get to the door that ought to be the abandoned house. And I love this little bit here, so let me just read it out. It says, "At last they came where they could see a little door in the brick wall on their right. There was no bolt or handle on this side of it, of course, for the door had been made for getting in, not for getting out. But there was a catch, as there often is on the inside of a cupboard door, which they felt sure they would be able to turn. "Shall I?" said Diggory. "I'm game if you are," said Polly, just as she had said before. Both felt that it was becoming very serious, but neither would draw back. Diggory pushed round the catch with some difficulty. The door swung open, and the sudden daylight made them blink. So I just love this memorable little moment here, this whole "I'm game if you are" bit, and this tension that the children and the readers feel about this great moment when they're going to take the step that they can't go back from. Their curiosity is about to be met, but there's also a certain amount of risk or a sense of danger that's involved. I love that relatable nuance about fear and saving face. They both felt hesitation, but they wouldn't draw back. Children, and adults as well, often push each other forward through fear or discomfort that would cause an isolated individual much longer hesitation. And this social aspect could be good or bad, depending whether that fear is justified or unjustified. In this case, since both of them have already decided together what they're planning to do, any last minute unwillingness would cause the hesitator to lose face. And in that sense, you could say that a plan that two people make together and then carry out together is an interpersonally reinforced plan, as opposed to an isolated person who establishes a plan of action and may quit his plan the moment the going gets tough or the moment some intimidation gets in the way. In this case, they would never draw back or give up. because they're together. Anyway, so they come out into Uncle Andrew's attic study, which is described in interesting detail with all these books everywhere and things and a microscope and this tray of beautiful and faintly humming yellow and green rings. But before they can realize their mistake and go back the way they came, the high-backed chair facing away from them gives a slight tremor, and Uncle Andrew rises up from it, quote, like a pantomime demon coming up out of a trap door, end quote. You gotta love the artistic word picture that makes you immediately afraid of Uncle Andrew by connotation. He's terribly creepy already, even before he's done anything to be creepy. And then he goes over to the door, shuts it, and turns the key in the lock, and says, "There, now my fool of a sister can't get at you." He expresses intense delight at having two children show up in his little study, and he explains that, quote, "this is too good an opportunity to pass up," end quote. And then finally he explains that he wants them for an experiment. They try to convince him to let them leave, which doesn't seem to be working. And then finally, Uncle Andrew turns to Polly, pays her a couple of compliments about her attractiveness as a young lady, and offers to give her one of the beautiful yellow rings. She takes a step closer, and Digory senses danger and shouts not to touch it, but it was too late because Polly was reaching for it. And the chapter ends with, "And immediately, without a flash or a noise or a warning of any sort, there is no Polly. Digory and his uncle were alone in the room." Now, two thoughts on this Uncle Andrew scene, and I'm going to expand on both of these. First, the role of intuition as a warning of danger. This is a theme, I think, throughout the book, usually with Polly being the one with the intuitions that warn of danger, and Digory is blind to them. But here it's the other way around. Digory's intuition warns of a danger that Polly is blind to. So that's the first one. The second one, the connotative role of the descriptions in this scene as, I think, possibly suggestive of the topic of child abuse, or even specifically child sexual abuse. I'll get into that as well. So this scene with Uncle Andrew, it's a really fun scene to read as a kid because it's frightening and tense, but also engages your curiosity and your sense of mystery and fascination. Reading it now as an adult, I still get that kind of ground level magical thrill, but there are also these two additional aspects that stand out to me. And both of these relate to the interacting roles inside our characters, the roles of knowledge or lack of knowledge, fear, intuition, judiciousness. So, for that first comment I made about intuition, I think it's a theme that goes through the book. It's the theme of this relational dynamic between Digory and Polly, in which Polly's sense of danger conflicts with Digory's lust for knowledge, or maybe specifically, we could say experiential knowledge. This is what leads to the major tension point midway through the book, when Polly's trying to get Digory to leave this post-apocalyptic world of Charn that they've found and go home because she senses danger. And Digory instead defiantly rings the bell which awakens Queen Jadis. Also, in light of the male-female personality distinction we talked about, you could frame this as female intuition versus male impulsivity or male drivenness. Polly's senses are more attuned, but Digory's inner drive is irresistible. As a result, they have their most vicious fight in the whole book. If my memory serves me right, I think that really was the most vicious fight they get into in the whole book. And also, this conflict connects with the climax of that subsection and with the emergence of a whole new layer of rising tension for the story, because it marks the end of their wide-eyed, quiet exploration phase and marks the beginning of the section characterized by the witch being on the loose and them having to deal with that, thus vindicating Polly's intuition. It's almost like Pandora's box was just opened up and then they can't get the demons back into the box, is kind of how it feels. But anyway, in light of that extended theme, it's intriguing to look at this scene and think about the role played by intuitional inner warning or sense of danger and the relationship dynamics that occur when one person's intuition doesn't match another person's intuition. Back when they were getting ready to enter the room from the crawl space, they shared the same inclinations and intuitions, and this led to them both stepping slightly behind their comfort level and walking into the room. But then they observe the room and they meet Uncle Andrew, and they both begin to intuit danger the moment Uncle Andrew starts acting creepy. And we could say this is the domain of lack of knowledge. The children don't know why he's acting the way he does. His actions don't make any sense, but something inside them tells them it's not right. Lewis has set up a situation in which the reader will share the children's intuition and maybe a little more. Because he already foreshadowed the character of Uncle Andrew by having Digory tell Polly how creepy he is back in the opening scene of the book. And then when he first appears here, Lewis describes him as like a pantomime demon rising out of a trapdoor. And then Lewis also gives us foreshadowing for our own intuition by telling us that Polly wasn't initially so frightened as she could have been until Uncle Andrew went and locked the door. So the connotations are piling up in order to inform the reader's intuitions. And Uncle Andrew's actions kind of look a little bit like someone who's getting ready to engage in some kind of child abuse. Neither the children in the story nor the original readers would likely have been thinking about child abuse, certainly not child sexual abuse, while reading this book. And it's hard to say if Lewis would have had that in mind, since things like that weren't talked about as much back in the 50s as they are now. But I don't think that means that individuals weren't talking about or knowing about such things back in the 50s. And I personally suspect that Lewis probably did, and that's probably why he writes this section the way he does. I wonder if he's intentionally trying to load up a composite image of evil into the otherwise naive minds of his readers, so that his readers may be a little more likely to be able to intuit a sense of danger in possible real life situations where naivety could leave a child far more vulnerable than necessary. So the readers come to recognize an evil person may express far too much delight in the idea of being alone with them, may be eager to lock the door to the room, may give Polly a compliment in regard to her attractiveness as a young lady, and then when she steps a little closer, Digory notices a greedy look coming through his face, as though it's leaking through his duplicitous laughter. It says his laugh sounded natural, but is kind of the way it's phrased. So it would have seemed authentic enough, but. Now, the thing is, Polly didn't see the greedy look come over his face because she was looking at the beautiful ring. Her intuition wasn't informed by this last and most frightening sign of ill intent. Just like in the Charn chapter later on, Digory's intuition wasn't as accurate as Polly's, which is what they fought about and ultimately what resulted in his defiant action and the awakening of Queen Jadis. But in this case, it's the other way around. And Digory tries to shout out and stop her. He says, "Polly, don't be a fool! Don't touch it!" But it's too late. I think this story is a fascinating and powerful exploration of the interpersonal dynamic that can play out between two people when difficult to label intuitions are playing out under the surface, and the two personalities and inclinations are just different. Lewis is painting Uncle Andrew with all kinds of frightening connotations, so that initially the reader knows to beware more than the children actually do. And then Lewis shows us some genuinely alarming behaviors that indicate ill intent, and has our characters recognize these as signs of evil, his excessive delight at finding himself alone with them, the greedy look that comes over his face, etc. But while the reader is well informed by Lewis's connotations, it takes Digory actually seeing that deceitful greed in his uncle's eyes to sense the immediacy of the danger of touching one of those rings. And Polly misses it because she was distracted by something that was so shining and attractive and innocent. And this happens in real life all the time. Two people who have two different personalities and two different sets of inclinations and intuitions, and often danger or harm take place within a context of lack of knowledge, just like in this case. A context when there are some important facts that you just don't know, that you can't know. And then things like intuition, moral reasoning, wisdom, advice from friends, or appropriate judiciousness can help you try to navigate those questionable situations where you're in a context of lack of knowledge. But I think the message of the book is that those situations of lack of knowledge, those situations of ambiguous danger, must be navigated together with a respect for one another, and with an attitude of openness to your intuitions and a respect for the moral inclinations or hesitancies of those around you. Because sometimes when you're looking at that catch on a crawl space door, it might be appropriate to urge each other on, but at other times, it might be more appropriate to do a check-in. What are you thinking? What are you feeling? Let's respect one another and do what's right, do what's best. Let's pursue knowledge while being careful enough to protect the things we may never get back if we lose them. And then there's one more theme that I'd like to touch on, which is closely connected to the above, and which also I think stretches throughout the book. This is the theme of temptation. which is a word that's generally used in religious or spiritual contexts. And I'm using that word intentionally because I think this theme culminates near the end of the book with the scenes connected to the magic apples, which seem to be a pretty clear callback to the Hebrew creation narrative in Genesis chapters 1 through 3, in which sin is introduced into the world when Adam and Eve succumb to temptation by tasting the forbidden fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And in religious pop culture, that fruit is almost always portrayed as an apple with a bite taken out of it, much like the magic apple in this story, which is initially offered to Digory by Queen Jadis, who plays a bit of a devil figure type of role in certain parts of the story. And got to take a little detour here, a little side note for my hobby horse. I'm always finding myself annoyed by casual references to Narnia as a Christian allegory as opposed to an actual work of proper fiction. It should be noted that having Digory be tempted by forbidden fruit is not an allegory for the biblical story in Genesis 3. It's an allusion or reference to the biblical story, and more particularly to the religious and spiritual themes that that reference invokes. Because an allegory is an extended metaphor where one thing represents something else. It's saying the same thing but with different imagery. This element in this story is saying a different thing with the same imagery. In contrast, Aslan dying on the stone table would be closer to an actual allegorical element, which is part of what makes that part of the wardrobe story a little less sophisticated in certain ways, even though the wardrobe story as a whole, I think, should not be called an allegory. But the scenes with the apple in this book are not this for that kind of symbolism or allegory, but rather a riff on a theme, an intentional reference to something familiar in order to use it to continue to explore and expand upon the same kind of thematic storytelling that has been going on throughout the book. And I think that's the kind of thing that we mostly see in the Narnia stories. And more to the point, no matter what you think about whether particular scenes should be called allegorical or not, you can just agree with me on that and it wouldn't bother me all that much. But what I am concerned about is that Narnia as a whole, and this book in particular, can only be called an allegory if you also call Harry Potter, The Lord of the Rings, Spider-Man, Star Wars, etc., if you call them allegories as well, since all good fiction uses the kind of storytelling that Narnia, for the most part, tends to use, with the exception of something like The Death on the Stone Table. You just can't reduce Narnia into simplistic this is that storytelling without really doing terrible injustice to the breadth and scope of what Lewis has actually accomplished here as a professional scholar in the field of literature and as a publishing hobbyist in the field of philosophy. Anyway, so that was a rabbit trail. Back on topic. So, temptation as a theme. I think we can definitely think of temptation as a theme that runs throughout the book and which culminates later on in the thread with the magic apples. I think the theme of temptation throughout this book is a very interesting narrative exploration of how different kinds of harmful allure can play out in relatable contexts. And what's interesting is that each temptation is uniquely selected for the person being tempted. So this is the kind of storytelling that can leave you afterwards, kind of pausing and reflecting afterward with the question, so what would tempt me? What tempts me personally and uniquely? What would my weak spot be? Because you might remember, Digory used the word mystery multiple times in this chapter, suggesting that mystery allures him. So his temptation was mystery or experiential knowledge. Polly's, on the other hand, was beauty, as well as praise within the context of innocence. Uncle Andrew's innocence, supposedly, and her innocence, truly. Because he offered her the ring and it was so beautiful. He offered her praise right before that about her attractiveness as a young lady. So it was beauty and praise within the context of innocence that made her vulnerable to harm. And in that later chapter in Charn, where Digory ends up awakening Jadis, I wouldn't be surprised if Lewis even had the word temptation running around in the back of his head. But particularly, let's call it temptation within relational context, or temptation in conjunction with ambiguity, and temptation in conjunction with disagreement based on other people's intuitions. Digory's crime, or his sin, wasn't in ringing the bell per se, so much as it was in defying his friend with an arrogant, presumptuous attitude. You could say his sin, if you want to use that word, would have been something like selfishness or mistreating his friend. Now, I think it's also worth noting within this context, in terms of the temptation for Digory being knowledge or curiosity or something like that, I think we should take a minute and point out that the message that's coming through here isn't that curiosity or knowledge is a problem. That would be an easy mistake to make. After all, if you think about it, the apple near the end of the story wasn't a cursed apple. It was the same magic apple that would later protect all of Narnia from evil for the foreseeable future. The problem wasn't the apple itself, but the fact that the agent of evil, Queen Jadis, wanted to trick Digory into using the apple in a harmful manner. And I think we could say that's supposed to be temptation as temptation. It's temptation lifted up as a prototype. So if we take that as the interpretive grid to understand the theme of temptation that runs throughout the book, then we recognize the book isn't suggesting that knowledge or curiosity are evils to be avoided, which is a criticism I've heard said about Christianity and the Christian creation story, the idea that the source of evil in the creation story is the tree of knowledge, and so knowledge is a bad thing to Christians, which I don't think is an accurate view of the Christian story or of this story here. And I think just in life, it's very much worth recognizing that curiosity is an extremely valuable virtue, as well as the pursuit of knowledge. And both curiosity and knowledge are really where progress comes from in society. And I would suggest that if they weren't good things, just like beauty is a good and priceless thing when Polly was pulled in by the beauty of the ring, if these weren't good things, then the temptation would be a really poorly designed temptation. But actual temptation only works if the thing you're being lured by or lured to is actually alluring, which is almost always going to mean that it actually has a lot of good within it in some way, shape, or form. So, to sum up, the point of the theme of temptation, I think, is not that curiosity or knowledge are temptation to be avoided, but that they can be lures for temptation. They can be good things being used for evil. Just like the magic apple wasn't a bad thing that was a harmful temptation by its own nature, but was instead a good thing that was thrust into the role of temptation because the improper use of it could cause harm, especially improper use under the management of a malevolent agency such as Queen Jadis. So, regarding knowledge or curiosity throughout the book, maybe we could say something like this. While knowledge is a good, it's not an overriding or absolute good, which means that other values or goals may be worth more than certain instances of knowledge or curiosity, in such a way that sometimes the morally right or even pragmatically right thing to do is sometimes to be willing to abandon the thing that you're longing for. Because within a context of evil or harm or malevolent personal agency, knowledge can be a source of harm. Not all knowledge is so fundamentally good that it's worth pursuing no matter the cost. And we could say that some knowledge is not to be pursued simply because of what comes with it. For example, the persons who want to use it, or the anti-knowledge or the lies that come with it, or the inevitable consequences that will play out after you've managed to get it. I think it's very fitting, if this is a theme here, curiosity as temptation, or knowledge as the instrument of temptation, I think it's fitting that this happens to be the Narnia story that ends up talking about nuclear holocaust. When Digory and Polly discover the post-apocalyptic wasteland of Charn, every inch of that dying and destroyed landscape was caused by the magical version of the atom bomb, as it were. The deplorable word, a secret of magic that Queen Jadis acquired at great cost, so that if she began to lose the war, she could say one magical word and destroy every living thing in the entire universe, except herself, which is what she did. She acquired that ultimate secret knowledge that by its very nature could be expected to result in more harm than good, and the end result was that that harm actually took place. So not all knowledge is overridingly good. Not all curiosity is overridingly good. And some of it, in certain situations, just actually isn't good to pursue at all. In the world of Harry Potter, you might think of Horcruxes, that poisonous knowledge that essentially served to transform Tom Riddle from being merely a really bad guy into being the iconic devil figure of the Harry Potter universe. Later, Harry and friends needed to come to understand Horcruxes as well in order to destroy the Horcruxes and defeat Voldemort. But pursuing that knowledge for the wrong reason, or pursuing that knowledge, let's say, under the manipulative influence of malevolent agency, was actually something that amounted to being a fundamental evil. So, let's move toward a conclusion here. So, Digory and Polly have met one another in this chapter. Digory and Polly have met one another and have become immediate friends. Digory shared his pain with Polly, and Digory's existential loneliness and emptiness were put on hold as he took his new friend and set off to have adventures with her. His mom is still dying, but at least he's not alone. He gets to go exploring and step away from his pain for a moment with the excitement of mystery, curiosity, imagination, exploration, fascination, and a kind friend to share it with. But in the midst of that, both of them are going to experience conflict because they are different people and they're driven by different things. And they're both going to face danger and they're both going to face temptation. And through it all, there's going to be hope because they're going to find not just Narnia, not just the prototypical utopian land in all of its spellbinding magical form, but most especially because they're going to find the source of that utopia, the glorious lion Aslan, who provides comfort and warmth and peace where Digory had found only loneliness and the slow, painful tearing of the sinews of his heart. It's going to be good stuff. But at this point, so far, the theme we've got so far is that temptation can take all kinds of forms, and we need to listen to others and be sensitive to the intuitions and the judiciousness of others to know what is a source of harm and what isn't. And our relationships and respect for others is always a higher priority than our own personal greed for knowledge or experience, the thing that drives Uncle Andrew and Queen Jadis. So that in the end, we, with Digory, can take the non-Uncle Andrew path and find safety and peace and joy with the likes of Aslan, rather than fear and striving with the likes of Uncle Andrew and the queen who he's going to be trying to get to fall in love with him later on. All right, well, I'm looking forward to getting to discuss chapter 2 next, so maybe I'll see you around in the next one. If you're interested in more videos about the overlap where sci-fi and fantasy meet with things like psychology, philosophy, and spirituality, then feel free to go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Or if you just want to follow my Narnia content and not my other stuff, you can subscribe specifically to Pondering Narnia in my channel's podcast section. All right, well, I'll see you in the next one.